Very good morning to you. Nice to be here this morning and to be out of the cold in Christchurch. Although yesterday my daughter said it was 25 degrees. She had a trampoline blow through her fence because of the wind was so strong. And just before my week down there, I've been cleaning up a tree. This beautiful, what's this plant here? Protea, the beautiful protea fell on her garden. So I've been chopping this tree up. And so I've had it with proteas and I've had it with Christchurch. So I've had it with the wind. And happy birthday, Richard. You're almost as old as me. Righty ho, here we go, having a look at these two very, very difficult texts. Nobody likes either of these texts. And why the election puts them both together, I have no idea. But I'm going to give you my take on what I think is the contextual kind of reality of these texts. We know that all texts can be taken out of context and you get to a completely different place than where the writer of the text was describing. And so I want to first of all think about this idea of a sword. I've come not to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. And this immediately evokes some kind of feeling in us that makes us think this cannot be the gospel. This cannot be the Jesus that I know, who loves me so tenderly and so beautifully, and he wouldn't dare upset my life. And a sword has no place in this realm, this new realm that he's created. And yet Jesus is very, very sure in this text that the sword is something that's come to the earth. Now, I don't know how much you've thought about this. Who's thought about what the sword might be? There's lots of things about this sword. I'm going to give you my take. It's a Hebrew take. It's how what Hebrew scholarship would want to talk about, and it goes right back to Solomon's reign. Remember Solomon and the mother whose child died in sleep, and then another woman came along, stole the child, and the one whose child it really was complained to the king or to the judge, got to the king, and the king looked at the situation and drew his sword. And he said, I have the solution. We will chop this baby in half, and you can have half each. Now, that's a bit strange, isn't it? We wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that as a priest, and I'm sure you wouldn't do that as a parent. But what's Solomon, in his wisdom, seeing? He knows that the threat of that sword will illuminate something really important. It will illuminate who loves that child. So when the mother of the child said, yes, do that, the one who was embracing the child, and the real mother said, no, don't do that, give it to her, Solomon immediately knew the sword indicated whether love was genuine, whose love was genuine, whose ownership of the property was real. And so the metaphorical sword that Jesus is talking about isn't talking about a sword of violence. It's talking about a sword that comes into our own being to determine whether the love we have is sincere and genuine, or whether the love we have is just a convenient love that wants everything to be just beautiful. And I want that baby, whether it really belongs to me or not. I want it because it'll make my life better, and I'm full of loss, and I want that to be filled, and I just am thinking about myself. And so the sword in the biblical context is looking at the motivations of the heart. That's why in the book of Hebrews it talks about the sword of the Spirit that divides soul and marrow, a bone and marrow, a soul and spirit. It gets right at that inside of us and works out what's going on. Now, who wants to be recipient of such exposure as that? Who wants God to be looking at and prying into our private worlds, our families, or our relationships with our teachers, or those four categories that Jesus raises in that context of the sword? Well, I don't know. Except I know that the sword reveals also something else. And again, this goes right back into the heart of Jewish rabbinic teaching. And that is this idea that we're all made in the image of God. Who believes that every human being is made in the image of God? Not just in the image of God, but God's image has been breathed into that person. When God breathed into the clay, he breathed God life into, or God presence is a better word to use there, God's presence into the life of Adam, the model that he had made out of the clay. and it became a living being, like God is a living being. And so there's this deep sense that the image of God, that God life that's within us, is identified principally by one singular thing in Hebrew tradition and in Christian tradition as well, I have to say. And what is that one single thing that determines God's life? Quickly. What? The Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. And if it's real, it'll spill into the life of your neighbor. And so there's this idea that the image of God, the life of God, is demonstrated in human beings' capability of loving. And so when you get Jesus talking about the disciples, it's interesting because he raises the issue in very specific ways. First of all, he says, although my translation is a bit different to Ian's, but a disciple is not above his teacher, a slave is not above his master. So this is right. But then he makes this strange allusion. If the household is Beelzebul. Now, Beelzebul is another Hebrew word. It just means Lord of
The fly.
the fly, but it really is the Lord who's associated with death, or think of your mind of a dead carcass that's surrounded by flies. So that's the idea. It's the idea is Beelzebul is the destroyer. He creates destruction that causes the flies to sort of come and breed and have their thing. Does that make sense? So what he's saying is, if you've got a servant or a master or a slave or whatever, wherever you fit, if the thing beyond you that's the head of your household is Beelzebul, if it's a thing producing death, and in this language we're going to see, this death is what happens in the absence of love. In other words, if you are called to be a community of love, and you decide not to use your love for the benefit of the community, then you'll be responsible for seeing decay in certain people's lives, where your life and your love is supposed to bring wholeness and healing. So on one hand you have wholeness and healing, on the other hand you have this decaying carcass filled with flies. I'm sorry about this is pretty gross, but the biblical imagery is not particular about etiquette. And so this is the language that Jesus is picking up on. So when he's talking about having fears of what people can do to you, the fear is legitimate. People can destroy you with their words. People can do terrible things to you and make you feel like you're dying, and gradually you feel like you're just rotten, you feel like you're dead meat, you feel like the flies are all around you, and suddenly you have no value and life's not worth living. I'm sure most of us, if we're real with ourselves, will have been through experiences like that. I've been through many. If I had to number them, I'd be running out of fingers. And so you've got this strange kind of thing going on in Jesus' teaching where he's saying the gospel is something that needs to be embraced powerfully. And you cannot live this love of God out into your communities if you let your family shield you from the dangers or the difficulties that you're going through. If you love father or mother, wife, sister, brother, uncle, aunt, anybody more than me, he's saying, then you'll use their love to protect you from the things that God with his sword wants to sort of dig out of you, so that your capacity to love is matured and developed, and you're able to do it much more easily. And so anything that we put around ourselves to try and protect us from God doing that work of making us a loving creature is something that God will always be opposed to. That's why he says if you save your life, and that means if you live your life not by the image of God or by God's life, but for your own self, for your own family, for your own ends, then you'll lose it. But if you give your life, all those things that might surround you, might protect you from being a loving person, then that life will be eternal. So that's background. What I really want to do is to get into Hagar's story, because this is the most extraordinary story, I think, in the book of Genesis. It's one of the ones that we hate most because we don't like what Sarah's doing to Hagar, and we don't like the idea that God would want to bless Ishmael and the Arab nations on the same level as Esau, as Isaac. And so we get this kind of thing going on, and we think, where does the story lead us? And so I want us to have a quick look at the story. If you know the book of Genesis, you'll know this almost identical story has been carried out previously when Hagar first conceived. What happened when Hagar? The story is that Abraham and Sarah were promised the world, this great nation, more vibrant than sand on the seashore, or the stars in the sky. And God delays and delays and delays and delays, and until Abraham's an old man and Sarah's an old woman, and they have all these intervening things going on. And then God says to Abraham, this is going to happen. The three men come and they talk to Abraham about it. Sarah's at the tent doorway, and she laughs. She says, here we go. God promising me, and I'm in my 90s, how am I going to have a child? I'm past childbearing age. And she laughs. Interestingly, Isaac, the name means laughter. So there's this strange thing going on here when, in the frustration of God's plan, Abraham and Sarah construe this relationship with Sarah's handmaiden. In the Hebrew tradition, she's a womb slave. You know what that means? It means they have women who just are there to breed for the family. And so it's a dreadful thing when we look at it in our culture. But this was very typical in the Persian culture where Abraham came from. So we have this promise of the child. So she goes, sleeps with Abraham. She has the child, and she conceives. And then something happens in Sarah. What happens when she sees the swelling tummy of Hagar? She becomes bitter. She becomes jealous. She becomes spiteful. She starts beating her. She starts treating her badly. So much so that Hagar, in fear for her life, runs away. And she runs away into the same place where she's sent this time by Abraham. She runs and she finds this well, and at this well, God speaks to her and gives her the most extraordinary promise that she's going to bear a child, and the child is going to be called Ishmael, which means God hears Ishmael. And so there's this idea of God hears her cry, hears her, and in that process, the child, he sends her back to Sarah's court. And so then the story comes now when the child's been born, Isaac's been born, and there's a big celebration happening. And in our reading today, the same animosity is taking place. Sarah is rising up because the text never says that Hagar mocks her, but the words come out of Sarah's mouth where she says she's mocking me because her son is a strapling youth now, and my son is just a little one and just been weaned, so he's 2 years old, and this is jealousy again grabs hold of her. What say Ishmael takes the blessing of the firstborn, and so she's really, really anxious, and she starts going Abraham and says, look, we can't have this. We can't have her living in my same household. Now, I say this because I want you to think about this and answer the question, who's in the right here in their responses before God? Who has the image of God being displayed in the story? Because one is submitting to the master, which she's supposed to do. That's what a slave is supposed to do. One is a wife entitled to all kinds of things, but is she entitled to treat a slave violently? Is she entitled to be jealous? Because what are all these things indicating? That she doesn't really trust God with his promise. God has said she'll have children. God said her children will be blessed, that they'll do all these things. And she's in this place now saying, in my world, this can never happen because all I see are these obstacles in front of me. Do you see where the text is going? And so the image now for, if you take the the context of the whole of the book of Genesis, the image is showing us what God expects, but how humanity continuously falls into another pattern. And the chief rabbi of London, who wrote the book Not in God's Name, specifically goes into this detail. He says, all the story of the patriarch can tell you how not to be a Jewish person, or in our case, how not to be a Christian person. And that the real pattern comes out through the life of Moses. But the patriarchs is to show us where humanity has gotten to, and in their own attempts. That's why Genesis is full of these wonderful heroes, but they're just so human. David mentioned that, I think, when he was looking at Abraham's call, that he's just a very ordinary human being. And Sarah is just a very ordinary human being whose primary responsibility to show forth God's life is not evidenced. So that brings us to the promises where God says to these two, and interesting, this is another Persian idea where you are allowed to give God a name, and in the end of this story it says, this is Hagar now, so she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roi. El Roi meaning you are the God who sees. You're the God who sees. So in the first instance, it was the Son was being called the God who hears. Now he's the God who sees. All these are the manifestations of God that people are supposed to find within us. They're supposed to hear God through us. They're supposed to see God imaged in us. And this is what the call to love really demonstrates. So in this story now, she goes back to Abraham after in the second story, where she's cast out into this place. She finds God at that same wilderness, and she puts her child aside to die out of her sight so she doesn't have to see it. And then there's this sense where the child is crying, she's praying, and she's saying, God, God, God. And then God said, the text is very clear to say, he doesn't hear Hagar's voice, but he hears the cry of the child. And so then he reaffirms the promise that this child, Ishmael, is going to be a leader. And of course, the Ishmaelites become the primary, in the area of the ancient Bible text, the primary traders of the world. They were really very big on trade, as of course Jews are famously known for in our current world. So they're brothers, and they both have this mandate. Interestingly, Hagar hears from God. Hagar sees God. Sarah never sees God. Sarah never speaks to God. There's no prayer comes from Sarah's lips. Sarah never has God speak to her. Hagar has all those things done twice. And so in our tradition, we toss Hagar into the category of those who are eternally lost and damned because they are not Jews. And yet in the Hebrew text, that's never the case. The case isn't designed because of your ethnicity or because of your lineage, but because of your ability to show forth God's life, God's love, God's care. And so that becomes paramount in both of these stories, where Jesus is teaching in Matthew and where we are talking from Hagar's story. So both of these issues lead us into this place, this personal space, where we have to decide, what is it that God gathers us for? Why do we bother coming to church Sunday after Sunday after Sunday? Who's asked themselves that question? Especially when the end speaking goes far too long. The point is, God wants a community that learns to love. This gathering is principally a training place for you to learn to love and share that love that God has given to you with one another. Not so that we become a little exclusive club where we just love each other and we just know everybody's lives and we're intimate with everybody's personal lives and we just kind of pray for each other and we're this holy huddle. But we learn to love in this group so that we can go from here as people that really know how to love the one who thinks differently to us, the one who seems to be prospering more than we are, having children when we're not, the one who seems to be, everything seems to be okay, but God calls us to be part of our community, loving in the same way that God loved Adam and Eve when he placed his presence within them. We become that presence to the world around about us. Now, that's all very nice when it's just in theory. But if I was to walk with you for 48 hours, or if you were to walk with me for 48 hours, you would realize there are so many times when we do not go the way of love. It's not easy to go the way of love. It's often very difficult. And yet God calls us to do that. And then when God begins to get that sword into our spirit and begin to cut away and reveal to us why we're not loving like we should, we complain and we say, well, God, if this is terrible, this is terrible. We get everybody praying for us that our lives will be better. When all the time God is saying, I'm just digging a bit deeper, getting a bit deeper. There's things I want to get out of you. There's things I want to expose so that you are more capable of doing that manifestation of love to the world that God has called you to. And this is where Christians really grind. They don't like that. They want God to be this God that just comes and gently leads us with such beautiful things, and he's my boyfriend and does everything that wonderful that I ask him to, and I love him, and I say these wonderful words to him, say, Jesus, I love you, I love you. Like some people in Jesus' community did. And Jesus turned to them and said, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. You didn't do it. You didn't love. You didn't bear yourself the way I wanted you to. You're still seeking your own ends. You're not seeking the neighbour's ends. You're just still looking after yourself, and you're not looking after what the neighbour's need is. And so this season that God is often placing us in is a season of exposure where we were opened up to things and we begin to see into our lives and we begin to see those things that inhibit our ability to be really Christian in those situations where we are aggrieved over certain issues. Who likes this kind of preaching? It's horrible. If I were you, I'd get up and walk out. I'm finishing now. But I hope we asked if I can do the prayers too, so I'm going to do those together because I want us to make this a reflective time of prayer. We can begin to see that the work that God is doing in us, the work that God is inviting us to do, it's hard work when we're resisting it. It's hard work when we're saying, not that person, I'll be nice, I'll be loving anyway, but not that person or not this situation. And we have certain things that have got us and they're robbing us of our life because we're letting them get under our skin. And God is saying, you've got to let that. You've got to let that go. If you don't let that go, then I cannot bless like I wanted to bless through the seed of Abraham. We'll never become that seed that does that work of blessing. Because I can guarantee the one God wants you to bless is the one you find it most difficult to love. Almost every time. And so in our prayers this morning, I want us to be thinking about our own personal journey, but I want us to be thinking about how our personal journey is affecting your neighbour, your neighbourhood, how it's affecting the world. We hear these stories where somebody hears about Jesus and then before you know where it is, they're missionaries in some foreign field because what's happened to them is just open gate after gate after gate and so many things are happening. And we're praying for the Bible Society today, a wonderful group that is involved in this kind of work. We're going to be praying for those in our own community, those at the Hope Church, who we know are hearing the gospel, the same gospel. We want them to be agents of change in their world. We're praying for our own situation, our own development, that God will bring us into a place where we're effective in seeing that blessing move from our life, God's life in us, into God's life into others. So let's pray.